Jim Hunter here, interviewing Gary Gillum.
Gary Gillum here.
Gary was a chief engineer for a long time at Klipsch and was the guy that hired me.
See.
Tell us a little bit about how you got involved with Klipsch and loudspeaker design in general.
Oh boy, that's a long story. I'll try and make it short. I heard a short horn.
Heard a short horn.
At my neighbor when I was in college.
And this would be in the late 50s.
Yeah, around 58, 9, 59, somewhere in there. I asked him about it. I heard it, we'd hear it in the evenings playing, and it sounded like some lady practicing her scales and so forth, but it just sounded beautiful, and it sounded like a real person over there. And I saw the gentleman one night and asked him if there was some lady there in music school, and he said, "No, that's my Klipsch short horn." And I said, "I don't believe it." And he took me over there, and sure enough, it's a Klipsch short horn, and I've never heard anything like that in my life, and I wanted to learn more about it, and I did.
And you contacted Klipsch pretty soon by letter.
Yes.
And who answered you?
Paul.
And that was kind of a surprise.
Oh, absolutely. And then later on, well, with Bob Moores as well, who later was president of the company, and we all corresponded. We'd go down and visit, kind of like the pilgrimage of Klipsch fans today. And Paul was very receptive, very friendly, very open to discussions about audio and hi-fi and construction of loudspeakers.
And you would even visit at his house.
Oh yes, yeah, we're very good friends.
This went on for several years, probably a decade or more.
Yes, yeah, more than a decade. And then they had an engineer that was leaving, and they finally asked me if I would take his place, and I said yes.
And that was about 74?
74 to 5, somewhere in there.
So you started out essentially as a project engineer, I guess.
That's correct. They were starting they called it industrial or professional pro division of Klipsch at that time, and Paul had a design that he wanted to pursue, and I was the pursuer, and doing the physical work and the measurements and so forth for a woofer horn that he had designed. And then it went on from there to eventually coming up with the MWM woofer that was in the MCM 1900 series.
At some point, you graduated. By the time I came there in '78, you were considered the chief engineer at that time.
Yeah, that was on my business card.
Okay.
Paul was always a chief engineer. That was something Bob Moores added, and he used to joke with me with people, and he said, "Well, Gary has a kerosene-powered oscilloscope at home," and he thought that was pretty funny, and he thought on my business card it ought to be printed, "I am an engineer." And somehow that wound up on there, and but truly Paul was always the chief engineer.
We're talking mainly about the Forte, but prior to that, you did have the honor of designing the first two speakers that Paul did not specifically design, and that was the KG2.
KG2 and the KG4, right.
And both of those, the KG2, not immediately, but very soon, had a passive radiator in it.
Very soon, right, that's correct.
Where did the passive radiator idea come in?
Well, a lot of people used passive radiators, and they wanted more bass and didn't want to make the box any bigger, wanted to keep it as a KG2. And so the alternative was to try a passive radiator in the back of the box because there was no other room. So that's where the rear of the box was utilized for a passive radiator, and it went through a lot of permutations to get it tuned correctly.
Did you also know about Don Keel's work with passive radiators at Electro Voice?
I did not.
Okay. So the passive radiator carried on through the KG4, and I guess was just a
Eventually,
natural
for the
in the Forte.
For the Forte. Yes.
How did you start working with passive radiator? I mean, technically, how did you start putting it in the design and tuning it?
Well, putting it into the design was to extend the bass. It also lowered distortion by having in essence, a vented box. Only the passive radiator takes the place of the vent.
The mass of the passive radiator is very important.
Yes, I was getting to that. I was just trying to figure out how to get it started. I found that not just any passive radiator would work. And so I got to thinking about adding mass to it to lower the resonance of the diaphragm. And so do I need to tell how I did it? With a screw? Huh?
Bolts and washers. Yeah.
Bolts and washers, yeah. I put a bolt through the center of the cone, which is a raw cone that hadn't been cut out yet for a voice coil. Then added washers and made measurements to see where the resonance was, and tuned the box according to the mass of the passive radiator. Finally wound up with a number of washers, and before trimming the cone body, at that time we poured epoxy in there, I believe, and put the number of washers that were correct, and that was it. Put a dust cap over it.
Well, why did the Forte come about? I mean, what was the basic design goal with Forte? What problem were we solving in the market, I guess?
The market position is what I was going to say, and something that followed along with the Klipsch philosophy of loudspeakers, and being horn loaded, at least in the treble system, which it was, mid-range and tweeter.
Did you ever consider it just a stretch heresy?
I don't really believe I did, but around the heresy parameters, the 12-inch woofer is what we wanted. A 12-inch woofer, wanted a narrow box that had some height to get the treble up near ear level when you were in a seated position. Okay. So made the box narrower and taller, and incorporated a riser base on the bottom to get it even taller, and the passive radiator was ideally located on the back, or the box would get too darn big. Was that enough?
Yeah. Well, a little bit about the industrial design. Were you given instructions, marching orders as to what the thing was supposed to look like?
No.
So you took your cue from...
No, we're talking about
the appearance.
Okay, of
the shape of the grill claw, the grill,
or the Forte. We're talking about
the Forte.
I thought you said industrial. I'm sorry.
No. When I say industrial design, I mean
yes, you're in a
its
different
appearance.
World. Yes,
the cosmetics.
Cosmetics. Yes, thank you. Yes. No, I wanted something that was attractive, that was different, that would be appealing to the eye, and so the riser base with the beaded cove bead or whatever it's called around the base looked attractive. I want to make it as narrow as you could put the woofer in, and to locate the mid-range horn as close to the woofer for polar reasons, response reasons, and likewise the tweeter. And that's how I wound up with it, with that design, and the height of it, and so forth was also not mathematically derived.
Right.
It was to look right. Then the challenge was to make what you put in the box sound right and sound like a Klipsch loudspeaker, And I think we did that with great success. The Stereo Review article on it said it had the best distortion, lowest distortion of any loudspeaker in the bass range that they had ever tested. And I think that speaks volumes for the design of the components and so forth, which, by the way, Mr. Jim Hunter is the one that helped with the woofer design.
Mm-hmm.
And he did.
I think to start with, I gave you a pile of parts to play with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I picked out I knew what kind of surround I wanted. And I wanted a reverse roll rubber surround.
why reverse roll?
It looked sexy.
Okay, and it was not put for any mechanical
No.
bumping into the grill
No.
or any of that.
No, it was just the opposite of what turned out to be. It could bump into the basket or the frame of the loudspeaker, which caused perhaps some concern, but it never caused a problem in production. It would depend on the one that you picked. And no, it looked good. I had heard other speakers that had that type of surround, and that was my goal, to try and reproduce something.
What role did Paul Klipsch play?
Well, he was ever guiding in discussions about designing the network in particular.
Uh-huh.
He was a network guru, and yeah, we talked about that a lot. There was one problem I want to go back and bring up about the cabinet design and dimensions. It turned out that the vertical height of the cabinet was such that it produced a reflection internally that caused a dip in the response, a hole in the response from cancellations that are, I forget, 160 hertz, somewhere in there. You just have to measure the box and calculate it. And so I scratched my head how to get rid of it, thinking back through some of the books I'd looked through and read about non-parallel surfaces and so forth. Well, we couldn't do that, but we could put a shelf a third of the way up, or at some point, to miss the woofer at an angle and just partially block the vertical path, and that dampened or canceled out the
Homogenized it at least.
yeah, and yeah, it disappeared. It went away, and whether or not that's done anymore, I don't know.
No, it's definitely still done.
It is
all the time.
Oh, okay, well,
At least at Klipsch, it's done all the time.
okay, yeah. Well, that's something that really caused me some concern as to how to get rid of that, and tried various ways, and that worked out to be the best. And I don't remember what the angle was, but it was at an angle in the box. It wasn't just a shelf like a ported box, and then
Yeah,
it was an angle designed to scatter the
the reflections.
reflection.
So did Paul play any part in the voicing or listening?
I'd like to say yes, but no.
Did not. Well, aside from myself, did anybody else get involved in the design of the thing? Was there any manufacturing engineering particularly that got involved, or was it just basically more of the same?
Really, the only thing that might relate to what you're asking would be that the Forte used a new tweeter that Klipsch had never used before, and it was tooled up by a machinist to follow a pattern that Paul and I had collaborated on and worked out for a new tweeter.
Okay.
And so yeah, that Paul.
And that new tweeter, basically, I think was that called the K75?
I don't remember.
But it was the first plastic tweeter horn that Klipsch did.
That is correct. I've got one in my
And it
hand here.
then carried on later into other Klipsch products.
Well, yeah, it was the first one. It was the first one, and it was to replace the T35, the Electro Voice
Yeah.
T35, and it did. And about killed Electro Voice later on.
That's why they quit making it for us eventually.
Yes, that's right. And they quit making it, and that in the end, in my later life after Klipsch, it almost put me out of business because I didn't.
Everybody needed it, and nobody was
didn't want to
getting it.
make it. Yeah. So anyway, yeah, and it's fun. I'm sure it's been refined since then, and now I understand Delgado has made a new tweeter with a Tractrix type tweeter to replace it. But yes, that replaced the T35, and it was
A quarter of the cost.
at a quarter. Okay, a quarter of the cost, and it had extended response over the wider bandwidth than the T35 Electro Voice.
Right.
Which they could.
It was the first time, really, that Klipsch ever hit 20,000.
That's correct. That is
the first time we got to 20,000 hertz.
You got it right. Mm-hmm.
The anechoic chamber at that time was maybe 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old.
The what?
The anechoic chamber.
Yeah. Okay.
And I'm sure you had used it a lot in all of the other development.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know what we can get out of this particularly, but the anechoic chamber was certainly a big tool in the development of the Forte.
Yeah.
And I guess it is going to be the exact same tool that was used in the Forte 2 and being used in the Forte 3 now.
Yeah,
so
sure.
there is
Of course. I mean, there's
a common tool there.
That's right, correlation between the two. And of course, the biggest. I used to tell a story. People would ask me a question about networks and differences in speakers, and I said, well, you know, they all sound different. Well, I said, I'll tell you what. If you take 3 engineers, audio engineers, design engineers, and you give them the same components, let's say it's a 3-way system, you give them a woofer, a mid-range, and a tweeter. Just the components. Now go home, bring me back a speaker when you get it done, and let's measure it and listen to it. And I guarantee you, you'll have 3 different sounding loudspeakers. Mm-hmm. I believe that. Never tried it. You want to try it?
No, I haven't got time. I'm retiring.
Yeah. Oh well, I have retired. Well, anyway, that's. The network is a big darn thing in speakers. Fine-tuning a network, as Paul used to say, you can, well, let's see. You design a network, you have all the figures worked out and what size this is, how many millihenry, how many capacitor sizes, and all that stuff. And he said, but he wrote me a note once, this was when we were working on the Forte. He said he had some different filter design part in it, and he said, try this. He said, but you and I both know that this is just a point of departure, and that's when you go in and start using your ears, and of course measurements as well, but you've got to use your ears. And all the speakers that I did at Klipsch were fine-tuned by listening, by ears.
Which is certainly what Paul did.
Yeah.
Forever.
And Klipsch had, but at Klipsch you had wonderful resources that they had in Paul's brain. But say on a filter you're working on and listening to it, you had the ability to, on a breadboard, let's call it, all the components are on it, and you can plug in this and out, take this out, plug that in, or in some instances you could plug in where a certain capacitor goes, and then we had a rack with a panel on it that you could switch different capacitors or plug in different capacitors. So you could sit there and you could listen and you could select.
You could tweak and listen
Tweak and listen.
in almost exactly the same time frame.
Correct. And you, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I doubt it, but were there any new or different manufacturing problems that had to be solved with the introduction of that box? I would assume different fixtures to assemble it.
We had to have different router templates and things like that.
We used on the Heresy, we had a clamping jig to clamp the box that John Corbin designed.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah,
And I'm
put the box.
assuming we.
Oh, I think we had some new ones made.
Yeah.
Maybe because you see, prior to the KG2, there's only one size of a small box, and that was a Heresy. And a friend of ours designed a pneumatic holding device that would clamp the 4 panels together and speed up production enormously and made it better from unit to unit, more accurate. And then the KG2 comes along, and they've got to make that, and it is a different design totally. And hello, all's well. 7 bells and all's well. Anyway, now where was I? The network. Then we're back to the boxes, and then
the KG2 is a different
KG2.
geometry.
What happened with the KG2 and going into the KG4? I don't remember how they put them together. I shouldn't have brought that up. There was some guy over in 56, Arkansas that made some fixtures that would hold them together. And
basically just derivatives of what Corbin did
that's
originally.
Correct. He designed, that John designed. And but what happened, they couldn't make enough of them. So when the KG2 came out, they were having trouble keeping up with production. KG4 come out, then they started having a shift at night. So after those 2 boxes came out, and then the Forte comes along, it was a factory running 24 hours, which before that, for those speakers, it was an 8-hour production. And now, I guess it's, So they made a big impact in.
Okay, so until we could get enough fixtures online, the manufacturing had to run as many as 3 shifts to keep up.
That's correct.
Which did incentivize us to make more jigs.
Yeah, that's a dance,
Yeah.
Jig dance. You're dancing around a lot in the factory.
Well, I guess the Fortes have been around a while. There's still a good market for them.
I have a
on
pair.
eBay.
Yeah. And I have a pair.
Are there any final words as to why you think the speaker has lived as long as it has and stood the test of time, so to speak?
It sounded musical. It sounded good.
Yeah.
It sounded good. Just like the Klipsch horn. It stood the test of time. Sounded good.